my job here in the next couple minutes is really to put a face on the problem of motorcycle safety in the state. But before we get into that, John Young, who was intended to present on instructor training and rider coaches this afternoon, lost his mom, so he is with his family. He will not be with us today. So if you know John, just reach out to him and give him some support. And we also, over the weekend, lost one of the people that was part of the Motorcycle Coalition, Bruce Reed, who was known as Popeye. He died on the 21st. So again, if that's somebody that you know, please reach out to their family and friends and let them know that you support them. I also want to apologize a little bit in advance, because one of the things about putting a face to this problem is that you might know these people. And so my intent is not to bring up any hurt or grief that if you know the two people we're going to talk about, but it's just to let you know that they're all different kinds of riders. They're all different kinds of motorists. But they're people. These are individual people that have died. They're not a statistic. They had family, friends, just like any of you in this room. Losing anybody on our roadways is something that we want to try to avoid and eliminate. Back in June, these two crashes took place over about a week's period. This lady, her name is Ray. She was riding her vintage Harley-Davidson up to Austin from the San Antonio area. She had some friends that were ahead of her, going to take her back after she sold this bike. She was on her way to deliver at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Her friends lost track of her in the rearview mirror. She was on I-35. There was a lot of traffic. She lost control of her motorcycle and hit a concrete barrier and went over the northbound Mopac at the Highway 183 ramp. So I went past her today coming from my hotel this morning. So her friends lost track of her, turned around, found out that she had crashed. She was 52 years old. She loved riding bikes. She had made a name for herself in San Antonio with UTSA women's basketball. She was the coach. She had been there for 13 years. She had just recently left to take care of her husband. That she worked to lead that team to 2 NCAA tournament appearances. This crash didn't happen at night. It wasn't a guy riding a bike, which is normal, not normal, but it's more frequent that these fatalities are males. She did have her Class M license. She had experience. She wasn't wearing a helmet, although, in that particular crash it probably would not have made a difference, but that's something that we look at. She did have a positive BAC. So this wasn't a 2:30 in the morning crash. This was something in the afternoon, out having fun, getting ready to sell her bike. But we lost her, and like we lose many people every year to motorcycle crashes. Some of those crashes we'll talk about later are single vehicle, only the motorcycle's involved. Others involve another vehicle, another motorcycle. Eight days later, this young man, 21-year-old Christopher Ray Saucedo, fell to his death in a similar motorcycle crash on July 5th. He had a family, parents, young kid. He was northbound on I-35 at Ben White just after 1 a.m. His bike also hit a concrete barrier on the north side of the exit ramp, and he was ejected from the bike. He was riding a 2008 Honda. He also had his Class M. He had a helmet. It showed damage. There was no BAC data, so there was no indication that alcohol was a component in this crash. Young kid, opposite end of the spectrum, driving a totally different kind of bike in the middle of the night. The idea when we look at these is these are lives cut short by things that can be prevented. Sometimes that's the prevention rests with the rider. In some cases it rests with the other people on the road. But that's what these programs that we're going to talk about today, and that's what TxDOT is working very diligent through multiple grant recipients and law enforcement to try to make our roadways safer. Just want to really go through fairly quickly. I'm going to really be talking mostly about what happened last year in 2014, which is the most recent data available. The motorcycle fatalities, there were 421 of those. That is down somewhat from the year before. One of the things that we notice is that we can't look at this as necessarily a trend. Because one of the problems that we have here is that you can see that the fatalities are up and down. One of the things that we can kind of be much more confident is our data is much better than it has been, 10 years ago. We have lots more information on what happened as part of that crash. The deadliest days were these 3 days. They were Saturdays and Sundays. That is definitely consistent across the year. Each one of those days had 6 fatalities associated with it. The average age is 42, but most of the fatalities occur young riders and older riders, which I hate to say older is 50 to 59 since I'm in that age frame, but older than 20 in chronological order, but young at heart for sure. But anyway, so we have two different, distinctly different demographics that we need to reach out to in order to make a big dent in fatalities. Gender, this is, I'm sure most of you probably recognize the fact that there's very small percentage of female, and this is just riders, this is not people who are passengers on the bike. They accounted for less than 3% of the fatalities during 2014, whereas the males accounted for about 97. From 2010 to 2014, we're seeing a decrease in the number of females that are part of that have fatal injuries as the actual driver of the bike. The issue is that we don't necessarily know the denominator of that, so it's hard to tell. We know how many people have M classes on their license. We know how many bikes might be registered to females versus males, but we don't know how many of them are riding during a particular time. So the males continue to increase. Ethnicity is really not a major issue as far as major changes. So white non-Hispanics account for 70% of the fatal crashes in 2014, with Hispanics being next with 19%. Driver behavior, which is one of the areas that we really concentrate on because that's what we can control. We can all control how we ride or how we interact and share the road with riders if we're the ones that are in a car or a truck. 43% of the motorcycle riders were wearing helmets when they were in fatal crash. The helmets definitely showed damage, which you would expect in trying to protect the rider. But still, in general, 50% of the riders are not wearing helmets on a day-to-day basis. So, and one of the things we'll talk about later on today is Mike Manzer, who also works with TTI, is going to talk about a survey gear use that will help not just with helmets, but with other types of protective gear. The types of motorcycles that are involved, This is an average over the 2010 to 2014 period, with cruisers accounting for the majority of these fatal crashes. Not to say riding a cruiser is a bad thing. It's just the number of them on the road has a lot to do with that statistic. Just in 2014, almost 40% of the fatalities occurred where the rider was on a Harley-Davidson. Again, that's not to say that any particular model or size of bike is bad. It's just that number, there may be more of that particular bike on the road during 2014 than there were others. You want to look at the engine size. The larger bikes clearly have are overrepresented in this particular group. Again, this is just in 2013 because that's the information that we had as far as registration was concerned and the bike size. Every year in the last 5 years, the most common year of a bike was 2007. This is, could be considered an interesting statistic or not, depending on your perspective. But we want to try to know: are those bikes, were they resold? Were they resold from just an individual to another individual? We don't know how many of those people had Class M licenses. So there's a lot of other statistics or data that we need to look at to understand why if that is even significant. We've had a lot of discussion, especially at the coalition level, about properly licensed individuals. 58% of the motorcyclists in 2014 were properly licensed. One of the things that we'll talk about a little bit later today, and this is some of the commentary that we would like to get back, is just because they're licensed, when was their training, if they got their license 20 years ago and they haven't been on a bike, that's really, we're trying to dig in a little deeper with the data to really understand what's going on with the individual people. Proper licensing has hovered between, around 58% for the past few years related to fatal crashes, but there's been an increase in the number of crashes that did not have a Class M endorsement on their license. And then also the people who may be riding a bike that have no license at all, no driver's license, no type of license. Intersection-related crashes, the fatals associated with those are remaining stable, but we are having an increase in incapacitating injuries. Off-road crashes, like a couple that we talked about today, those really aren't the typical ones. It's really running off some of the more rural and suburban roads. They have remained stable over the last few years, so the message is getting out there. Work zone crashes, this really has depends on how many work zones are in place in the state. We've noticed in 2014 and some of the past years that those work zone crashes are really happening more in the rural areas. Again, this is something that we need to be able to investigate at a more deeper level so we understand what were the other causes related to that. Head-on crashes, overall the the rural and the incapacitating crashes are decreasing, but the urban ones are increasing. And the last one, crashes and impaired driving. 55% of the fatalities had a known BAC were positive. One of the issues that we have in the state is that if it's a single vehicle crash, we may not, that individual, whether it's the rider or the driver, so it's not this is not motorcycle specific. If it's a one person, one fatality crash, frequently they will not be tested because of costs and a lot of other instances at the local level. So this is just of the ones that have been tested, they had a positive BAC. Where the BAC was known, the average was well above the legal limit of 0.08. And the BAC, those that were above 0.08, so this kind of gives you, the average isn't artificially made smaller by the people who did not have BACs, is more than twice. So we're not talking about just a couple of beers. We're talking about people who have no business in a car, let alone on a motorcycle, because of their vulnerability. For the fatal crashes, there appears to be really no correlation between equipment use and their BAC, so it's not that, you know, the higher the BAC, the less equipment they have on, that there's no correlation in that particular thing. So that's just a few state level statistics. We're going to, Ken Copeland will be going on, being a lot more detailed about the data, but the point of this presentation was to really make things personal. A lot of us in this room ride, some don't ride, some have friends that do, some don't. But even though we all have completely different perspectives, it's all our responsibility to try to keep Texas roads safer. So when you're on the road with somebody who is, you know, you're sharing the road with somebody who's on a motorcycle, it is your responsibility to try to keep that motorcyclist safe, and vice versa. Riding a motorcycle, it's, you know, it's really, a lot of times it's self-protection and being defensive about how you're riding. We want to consider how we can improve rider safety. So a lot of that, as part of a large project that we have between TTI and TxDOT, is to reach out to motorists. Part of that project does reach out to motorcyclists as well, but the idea is to raise the awareness of people who are not riding so that they do share the road with those riders in a safe manner, and we can reduce the number of fatalities and serious injuries on our roadways. I want to really thank you ahead of time for your input. This is a time where we bring a lot of different types of people together. Forum really is not just a one-way conversation. We really want your feedback. So if you feel comfortable talking, you know, raising your hand and talking during the forum, great. If you don't, write it down on the evaluation, grab somebody, say, hey, I've got this great idea, or I really have an issue with this. We need that feedback. This is your state, these are your roadways, and we need to make them safer for everybody in this room and outside.